My name is Claire Brennan, and I was 32 years old the first time I realized my father had two completely different versions of me stored in his head. The useful version, that one he knew cold. That was the daughter who balanced his restaurant's nightly deposits when I was 16, because the bookkeeper quit and he didn't trust anyone else. The one who memorized the vendor delivery schedules, caught the overcharges, flagged the slow-moving inventory before it spoiled. Visual. Restaurant office. Ledger, books. All. Cash drawer, open day. I am a money show you. Of him, up in a would show you. Oh. He'd pat my shoulder when I hit him the nightly numbers and say, "Good girl, Claire," the same way you praise a dishwasher who didn't break anything. The other version, the one he actually had to think about, that daughter barely existed to him at all. I found that out in the summer I turned 11, when my sister Natalie was chosen for the regional youth choir. My parents threw a party. Not a big one, just close family, and a few of their restaurant regulars who'd known us since we were small. But they put up streamers in the backyard, and my mother made her famous lemon cake, and my father gave a toast about how proud he was, that his youngest daughter had real talent and something special. I was 11 years old, and I had just gotten my first academic award, a district-wide math placement, highest score in my grade. I'd brought the certificate home in my backpack. I'd laid it on the kitchen counter next to the mail, where everyone walked past it all afternoon. Nobody said a word about it. I watched my father pour champagne for the neighbors, and I told myself he'd notice later. He just hadn't seen it yet. Visual. Kitchen counter. Paper certificate. Champagne glasses behind it. At the end of the night, when I went to retrieve it from where I'd left it, the certificate was gone. I found it an hour later, crumpled and damp in the trash can beside the recycling bin. Someone had put it there. Someone had missed the recycling bin or didn't care, and the edge was stained with lemon cake residue. I fished it out and smoothed it flat and put it in my sock drawer and never told anyone I'd seen it there. I remember thinking, at 11, that I must have done something wrong. That good scores weren't the kind of thing you celebrated, not like a voice. That usefulness didn't earn you a toast. 21 years later, I'm the one who runs the entire financial operation behind my father's restaurant group. 7 locations across 2 counties. I've been doing it for 12 years. 12 years exactly from the summer I turned 20, and my father sat me down in the back office of the original location and told me, "You understand numbers, Claire. That's what you're for. Visual. Office ceiling tiles, filing cabinet, fan blades rotating slow." 12 years. I'm 32 now, and he's never once put my title on a business card. I'm listed in no org chart. When vendors call and ask who approves the quarterly contracts, my father's name is the one they get. When the bank asks for the primary signatory on the operating accounts, his name is on the paperwork. His name, his credit, his face at the ribbon cutting. I'm the hand moving the pieces on a board nobody else in my family knows how to read. And the thing about being invisible is that sometimes you see everything. Visual, dinner table, place settings, a laptop open to a spreadsheet. This story starts at a dinner table, my parents' house, the 3rd Sunday of every month. My father's been running this ritual for as long as I can remember. He calls it family check-in, which sounds warm enough, but it's really a performance review. He sits at the head of the table. My mother serves the food. Natalie, my sister, the one with the voice, sits to his right, and I sit to his left, And for 3 decades, that seating arrangement has been the map of everything our family believes about itself. Natalie is the talent. Natalie is the one who almost made it. That's how my mother phrases it even now, like she's describing a loss that hasn't quite finished happening. She was in a band in her 20s that got a development deal. Oh, they recorded an album that never got released. The label folded, the band broke up, and Natalie moved back home and started teaching voice lessons out of my parents' spare bedroom. She's 30, still single, still beautiful, still the one my parents talk about in tones of pure, uncritical hope. I am the one who pays the family's phone bill. That's not a metaphor. I'm the one who actually, literally, pays the phone bill, and the car insurance on both my parents' vehicles, and the property tax on the restaurant building, and the quarterly payroll for the kitchen staff at the original location, which my father hasn't looked at personally in 7 years. Visual checkbook. Bills stacked in a mail sorter on down your copy. Gray winter light through a window. No. I am dollars. Nobody asks me to do this. I was just the only one who noticed 12 years ago that my father was paying penalties on late filings because he couldn't track the paperwork. I stayed late one night and built a spreadsheet. I put the dates in color-coded columns. I showed him how much he'd save if someone monitored the deadlines. He said, "Good, you do that." And I did. And for 12 years I did. I built the system, maintained the system, fixed the system when my father tried to access it on his phone, and accidentally deleted 3 rows of vendor information. I never got thanked. I never got asked. I just kept doing it because someone had to, and I was the one who understood. The problem with being the one who understands is that you become the one who can't say no. My mother told me that once, in a different way. She said, "Claire, you always understand." That's the line. That's the one she's used my entire adult life, every time something needed to fall on me instead of Natalie. "Claire, you always understand that your sister needs the car. Claire, you always understand that your father's under a lot of pressure. Claire, you always understand that we can't afford to celebrate both of you the same way. You always understand." She says it like it's a compliment. She's been saying it since I was 11 years old, and I found my crumpled certificate in the trash, and I didn't make a sound. She's been saying it since I was 16, and I balanced the restaurant deposits, and I didn't ask for a paycheck. She's been saying it so long I forgot there was any other way to be. Now. Visual. Kitchen counter. A phone screen glowing with missed calls. A calendar marked with red X's. Until this month. It started with a phone call from my father's accountant. Sure. A man named Howard Finch, who's been doing my family's tax work for 23 years. I'd spoken to him maybe 4 times in my life, always about a discrepancy in quarterly reporting. But the call I got on a Tuesday morning wasn't about a discrepancy. It was about the restaurant group's line of credit at the bank. A line of credit I'd never seen, never signed, never been told existed. A line of credit that had been opened 18 months ago in my father's name, secured against property I thought my parents had owned free and clear. Howard said, "I'm only bringing this to you because I've been CC'd on 3 overdue notices from the bank, and nobody's responding. The principal is just under $300,000. The payments are 6 weeks past due. They're going to start foreclosure proceedings on the building. your father put up as collateral if it isn't brought current by the end of the quarter. No. I asked him what building. I'll maybe. What? It was the original restaurant location. The one my grandfather opened in 1974. The one my father had inherited, renovated, and, apparently, used to guarantee a loan I never knew existed. I asked Howard if my sister knew. He said he'd see Seder on the same 3 notices, and she'd never replied. I asked if my mother knew. He said he'd see Seder too. 3 notices. No response. 12 years. I'd been running the day-to-day financials for 12 years, and nobody had thought to mention a line of credit that was about to take the entire business down. Visual. An office filing cabinet drawer pulled open, manila folders, a yellow legal pad. I called my father that evening. I didn't scream. No, I don't scream. That's never been my role. I asked him as calmly as I could why he hadn't told me about the loan. He laughed. He actually laughed and said, "Claire, you always understand that some things are above your pay grade." I said, "I don't get paid." He said, "Exactly. You're family. We don't pay family. That's not what this is." That was when I started to see it. The shape of it. The mechanism I'd been holding in my hands without knowing it for over a decade. Visual. A computer screen. An email inbox. A highlighted message from a bank. Howard had sent me the original loan documents as a PDF. I opened them that night, and I read every single page. Every clause. Every signature line. Every guarantor requirement. There, on page 17, in a paragraph I suspect no one but a tired lawyer ever read, was a provision about the collateral. The building was pledged against the loan. Yes, but the loan itself had a secondary guarantor requirement. A personal guarantee from the primary operating officer of the restaurant group. My father had signed that line. But below it, there was a second signature line for secondary operating officer, and it had been left blank. The bank had approved the loan anyway, 18 months ago. How? And the way the clause was written, the secondary guarantee wasn't required at disbursement. It was required to be filled within 3 years of the loan's origination. If it wasn't, the entire loan would accelerate. The full principal due in 90 days. I'd been the de facto operating officer for 12 years. I had the emails, the spreadsheets, the vendor contracts, the payroll records, the handwritten notes my father had sent me delegating decisions. I had all of it. But he'd never made it official. He'd never put my name on anything. Because if he had, I would have had to sign that secondary guarantee, and I would have seen the loan. He hadn't forgotten to fill it. He'd avoided it, deliberately. He'd left me off the paperwork so I couldn't stop him from doing what he wanted with the money. Visual. A phone screen. A text conversation. A long pause before typing. I spent 2 weeks figuring out what had happened to the loan. It wasn't hard. The trail was sloppy. My father had transferred the money to a separate account he'd opened in his name alone, and from that account he'd made a series of payments to a construction company in Florida. A condo development? Some kind of investment that had gone sideways within 6 months. The money was gone. The pay. And the original restaurant building, the one my grandfather bought with cash in 1974, was about to be seized by the bank. I sat in my apartment that night and I counted. 12 years, 4,380 days. I'd filled the gaps, paid the bills, run the numbers, kept the lights on. I'd been the steady heartbeat under every success my family claimed. And the moment they needed to sacrifice something, the moment there was a risk, they'd hidden it from me. Because I was useful, but I was never worth protecting. The second incident that proved it, the one I'd been telling myself wasn't real for years, came back to me as clearly as if it was happening again. I was 24. Natalie had just started teaching voice lessons out of my parents' spare bedroom. She was struggling to build a client roster. Oh. My father asked me if I would cover her car payment for 6 months, until she got established. He said, "Claire, you always understand that your sister needs a little more help right now." I said yes. I always said yes. I paid her car payment for 18 months, not 6. She never thanked me, and wow. I knew already, sure. My father never mentioned it again. Now I'm a custodial card, nothing stress. Whole. And when I needed money for a down payment on a small house 3 years later, my parents told me they didn't have anything to spare. They just paid for Natalie to take a month-long vocal workshop in Nashville. $5,000. They gave it to her as a birthday gift. I bought the house anyway. A small one. A fixer-upper in a quiet neighborhood. I paid the mortgage by myself, on a salary I'd never asked my father to formalize. I painted the living room myself. I learned to fix the sink myself. And I kept showing up at the restaurant every day because I couldn't imagine who would do it if I didn't. Visual: a small living room, paint cans, a window overlooking a quiet street. 12 years. I'd kept them afloat for 12 years. The mechanism I'd found in those loan documents gave me a way out. Not a weapon. I wasn't interested in weapons, but a door that I could walk through and lock behind me and never come back. The secondary guarantor requirement had to be filled within 3 years of the loan's origination. That date was coming in 63 days. If I didn't sign, the loan would accelerate. If the loan accelerated, my father would have to pay the full principal. He didn't have the money. He'd lost it in that Florida investment. The building would be seized. The restaurant group would collapse. But there was another clause, a small one, buried deeper. If the secondary operating officer could demonstrate that they had been performing the duties of that role for a continuous period of more than 5 years prior to the loan's origination, their signature could be substituted by a formal declaration of continued service. In other words, I could prove I'd already been doing the job. I could provide my work history, the spreadsheets, the payroll records, the decades of evidence. And once that declaration was filed, the bank would deem the guarantor requirements satisfied. The loan would revert to regular payments. The building would be safe. But the declaration had to be filed by me, not my father. He couldn't do it on my behalf. And the declaration carried a specific consequence. It formally established that I was the primary operating officer for all purposes related to the loan. Which meant that if my father tried to take out another loan against the same collateral, I would have to be notified. I would have to co-sign. I would have to agree. It was the same mechanism he'd built to keep me out, and I could use it to lock him in. I didn't decide anything that night. I just saw the shape of it, the lever I could pull, the quiet, boring, bureaucratic power that had been sitting in the margin of a loan document for 18 months, waiting for someone to read it. Visual. A desk, paper documents arranged in rows, a single yellow highlighter. The escalation happened over the next 3 weeks. My father started calling me more often, not to ask how I was, to tell me about problems that needed solving. The liquor license renewal was coming due. The insurance provider had raised rates. The freezer at the third location was failing, and the repair estimate was higher than he'd expected. Each time he ended the conversation the same way. "You'll handle it, Claire. You always understand." The third time he used that line, right before the climax in its most public moment, was at the anniversary dinner. It was my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. They'd rented the private room at a downtown steakhouse. 40 guests, the family, the restaurant regulars, a few local business owners my father wanted to impress. Visual. A private dining room. White tablecloths. Centerpieces with low flowers. I'd been told to arrive early to help with the seating chart. My father had handed me the list and said just put Natalie near the center. The Caldwells are coming, and she might be able to get them to invest in her studio. The Caldwells? A local real estate family. The kind of people my father spent his life trying to impress. They owned half the commercial property in the county, and my father had been courting them for years. He'd recently sent them a proposal to lease space in one of their new developments for a 5th restaurant location. A deal he'd negotiated himself without showing me the financials. A deal that I'd recently discovered included a personal guarantee from him. He hadn't told me about that either. At the anniversary dinner, I was seated near the back, not at the family table, at the overflow table with the accountant and the retired chef, and some cousins I barely knew. Natalie was seated between my parents, and to her right was Mrs. Caldwell, a small woman with kind eyes and expensive jewelry who kept asking Natalie polite questions about her voice studio. I didn't mind being at the back. I was used to it. I was there to handle the bills, and as usual, no one had asked me if I wanted to be somewhere else. Visual. A long table, silverware, a guest's hands smoothing a napkin. Then my father stood up to give a toast. He talked about his marriage, his family, his gratitude. He talked about the restaurant he'd built. He talked about his daughters. He said, "Natalie has always been the heart of this family, the joy, the talent." And then he paused and looked around the room, searching for something, and his eyes landed on me at the overflow table. He raised his glass and said, "And Claire? Well, Claire always understands. She's always been the one who just understands." The Caldwells looked at me. The rest of the room looked at me. The retired chef, who'd known me since I was a child, looked at his lap. And I realized in that moment that everyone in that room knew what he meant. Everyone had always known. I was the one who understood, which meant I was the one who got the leftovers, the one who didn't need to be celebrated, the one who kept the engine running while everyone else took the credit. I didn't say anything, not yet, but I felt the mechanism in my pocket. The declaration I'd already drafted, printed, and signed. I'd done it 3 days earlier, in my small house alone. I'd walked to the mailbox that evening and dropped it in. The bank had received it. The loan had been restructured. My father didn't know. 12 years. I'd been under the machine for 12 years, and he'd never once asked how it felt. The toast ended. The dinner continued. Natalie made a brief speech about how much her parents had sacrificed. She didn't mention me. She never did. And then my father made a remark to the Caldwells about his restaurant legacy and his vision for the next decade, and I heard myself ask a question. Visual: a woman sitting at a table, a glass of water, a soft, calm voice. I said, "Dad, how are you planning to pay for the next decade?" He laughed. He laughed and said, "Claire, you always understand that we don't discuss business at the dinner table." But Mrs. Caldwell was looking at me now. Her expression wasn't annoyed. It was curious. So I kept going. I said, "I'm not trying to discuss business. I'm just wondering, because I filed a declaration with the bank this week that restructured the line of credit you took out against the original building, the one with the $300,000 principal that's been past due for 6 weeks. The room was absolutely silent. It was the kind of silence that made my ears feel pressurized. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my bag. Now, it was a copy of the declaration. No, it was within my pocket. I didn't hold it up theatrically. I just placed it on the table beside my plate and let the watermark show under the light. Visual: a piece of paper on a white tablecloth, a signature, a bank logo at the top. My father said, "You filed what?" I said, "The Secondary Operating Officer Declaration, page 17 of the loan documents. You never filled out the secondary signature line, so the bank had 3 years to get it. The deadline was 63 days out. I've been the operating officer for 12 years. I had more than enough documentation. I filed the declaration, the bank accepted it, and the loan is now restructured. Your monthly payment is lower. The building is safe. But the declaration also means I'm on the loan as the primary operating officer going forward. Any new borrowing against the collateral has to have my signature. You can't take out another loan without me knowing about it." He stared at me. His face was losing color in a way that looked almost medical. He said, "You had no right." And Mrs. Caldwell said, "Actually, he did." Everyone turned to look at her. She set down her wine glass and said, with the calm precision of someone who reads contracts for a living, "A secondary operating officer declaration, filed with proof of continuous service, is legally binding. The bank can't reject it if the documentation is in order." She's correct. The collateral is secured. Her father can't borrow against it without her authorization now. Again. My father's mouth opened. Now, closed. Opened again. He wasn't a stupid man. He knew what this meant. He couldn't run from it. Visual: a middle-aged man's face. A flush rising from his collar. A clenched hand on a tablecloth. He said, "Why would you do this to me?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't deliver a monologue about all the years I'd been invisible. I just said, "Because you always told me I understood." And then, I left the dinner. I walked out of the steakhouse, and I got in my car, and I drove home. My hands were steady on the wheel. My breathing was normal. I didn't cry. I don't cry. That's never been my role. The next morning, I turned off my phone. I went to work. Not at the restaurant. I never went back there. I went to my house. I painted the living room a color. I'd been wanting to paint it for 3 years. A pale green, like the inside of a sea glass bottle. I let the windows open. I made coffee. I sat on my floor and watched the light shift across the fresh paint. Visual, a small house, a freshly painted wall, sunlight through a window, a mug of coffee on a wooden floor. The calls started coming at noon. No. My mother, my father, Natalie, a series of numbers I didn't recognize. I didn't answer. I listened to the voicemails as they arrived, one after another. My mother said, "Claire, you need to call us. Your father is very upset." My father said, "You can't just do this and disappear. We need to talk about how we're going to fix this." Natalie said, "I don't know what you think you're proving, but you've humiliated everyone." I didn't call back. I sent one email. Howard Finch. I copied my parents and Natalie. I wrote, "I am no longer involved in the financial management of the family's business. Effective immediately, all billing, payroll, vendor management, and reporting responsibilities are hereby returned to the individuals whose names are listed on the organizational document." I have attached a list of the current vendors and their contact information. I have also attached the current bill schedule for the next 90 days. Best of luck. Then I changed my locks. I updated my mailing address. I removed my name from the family phone plan. 12 years. That was the number that kept running through my head. 12 years of invisible work. 12 years of being told I understood, which meant I didn't need to be seen. The first week of fallout was the loudest. My mother left 12 voicemails. My father texted me a series of messages that started with anger and ended with bargaining. He offered to put me on the payroll. He offered to give me a title. 9. He offered to make things right, though he never seemed able to articulate what that would actually require. The restaurant group started to fracture within 10 days. I'd heard that from Howard, who called me once, just once, to say he was sorry for the way things had turned out. The construction company in Florida was suing my father for breach of contract, he said. The second location's payroll had bounced twice. There was a line pending on the third restaurant's equipment because my father had stopped paying the lease. Visual, a phone screen with a voicemail icon, a light blinking slowly in the dark. It was all so predictable. Without me, the machine didn't run. And my father had never learned how to oil the gears because I'd always been the one doing it. Natalie called me on the 14th day. Her voice was different on this call. Softer, she said. "I didn't know you were doing all that stuff." I said, "I know you didn't." She said, "You always made it look easy." I said, "That was the point." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a reconciliation. But it was the first time she'd ever acknowledged that there was a version of our family where I wasn't just the afterthought. I think about my father sometimes. I think about him standing at the anniversary dinner, his face losing color, realizing that the daughter who understood had finally done something he couldn't control. I don't feel angry when I picture him. I just feel tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying a weight you didn't realize you were holding until you set it down. It's been 6 weeks now. I still haven't gone back to the restaurant. I don't plan to. I'm starting a consulting business out of my house. Small. Just me. Doing numbers for local businesses who don't want to pay for a full-time accountant. I'm painting the rest of the house. I'm learning to cook. I'm sleeping without my phone beside the bed. Visual. A small kitchen, a pot on the stove, a window looking out onto a quiet street, a phone face down on the counter. And I realize now, sitting here on a Saturday morning with coffee and a paint-stained shirt, that being understood isn't the same as being loved. Being understood is just being seen clearly enough to be used. And I spent 32 years being the one who understood, because I thought that was all I was worth. But I know better now. I'm Claire Brennan. I'm 32 years old. And I finally stopped understanding.